Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. Today's review is on the TAL-Reverb-4. It's freeware, and I covered a TAL synthesizer a couple of reviews ago, so if you're interested, go have a look. This video is actually going to come in two main parts. The first part will be looking at the device TAL-Reverb-4, and then the second half will actually be a tutorial on what reverb really is, how it gets to be the way it is, and how you can build and design your own reverb spaces, either from using the springboard of a pre-designed reverb unit like TAL's Reverb-4, or getting into using your own delay lines. This is important because this is how you end up getting your sound rather than having the same sound as everybody else. Who is Tal? Well, as I said, we've covered that before. Tal's a respected developer. He's been around for a long time. He's got some pretty well-known devices, including his reverbs. Anytime in a forum where someone goes, oh, I want a free reverb and I want a good one, then one of the first answers will be one or several of Tal's reverbs. In terms of pricing, well, we couldn't get a lot better because he is offering this thing free. Now, we'll start with going over the good and bad, and that is that it has a very thick sound. That is really good. It's pretty simple to use, and we'll cover some of the reasons why there's a slight sense of hesitation there later, and that's nothing really to do with his device. Obviously, his pricing is great. Bad, and to be very fair, I'm probably having to scrabble around a little for these, but something that has come up for me several times in the past with this device, and even the moment I turn it on, and you'll hear it here, is that it can come across as a little too dominant in a mix. Now that is fixable, but that does require some of the skills, some of which hopefully you will acquire if you watch and take the time with the tutorial later. So negative is it can, especially in its default states, come across as being too thick, too much, but that can be fixed. And again, really scrabbling, yes, control bin can be a little bit limited, but it's a free device that offers a huge amount more control than you might initially think. But because it's kind of a one knob device in terms of the reverb shape, and again, we'll get more into that later, then you have some limited control over the reverb shape. But that is me being pedantic. All right, let's look at the actual device itself. With a reverb, obviously, a lot of that's all about the sound of it. So I have created a drum loop, which is what we use for this. Drum loops are easy for showing reverbs. It's not my favorite way of testing a reverb, but it's very easy to hear what's going on. That's why we're going to use a drum loop. Dry drum loop. Now, there's just samples dragged in with no particular work done to them. Now, that's with the reverb in. You hear as soon as the reverb comes in, it is too much. Now, obviously, the default sound is going to be about, here, let me show you how much of a movement I'm going to make. There are presets in here. I never touch presets. You might want to look at them just to get a sense of, well, okay, how does he define what a short reverb is going to be? And again, remember, in the tutorial, we'll discuss a lot more of that because it's far better for you to finesse and create the sound than it is to use presets. Presets are designed for somebody's particular application, and chances are it's not yours. The reverb is simply a space. So we look at here, if we go back to our defaults, double click, everything goes to its default setting, and then we can start to work with what we want. That's obviously just far too much. You can try and solve it with dry and wet, but it's never really going to solve it because it's the length that's the issue. So we will look at, okay, the first obvious one's going to be size. We can change, and this is what I mean about it being a little bit of a one knob device, in that what would normally be several parameters in a more complex reverb unit, and therefore probably highly priced, would be 3, 4, 5 different knobs. and this is all rolled into one. What his secret sauce for managing the algorithm underneath it doesn't really matter. You can simply go, well, if I want the reverb to be shorter, I will pull it back. If I want it to be longer, I'll push it out. With drums, generally, you're going to want a short-ish reverb. But the other parameter here that really affects things quite dramatically is the diffusion. We'll discuss diffusion later. Diffusion, quite simply right now, complexifies the sound, and in this case is prone to making it seem a little longer. It does make it richer and seemingly smoother, as in there is less sense of being able to hear the taps individually. They kind of close up. But where you're finding the reverb tends to overpower, to be too thick, too obvious, too much, then you may well be wanting to pull the diffusion back. And you might initially think, why would I want to have a less diffuse reverb? It wants to be the thickest, smoothest, fattest, creamiest thing ever. Actually, no, it doesn't. So for your drums, you may well want to pull back size. And that way we can run a fairly wet signal without it actually becoming problematic. So size is broadly your length. Diffusion is broadly how rich or thick that reverb, how smooth that reverb is, and it will add a little bit more length. Then we get to delay. If I would be fussy, really it should be called pre-delay. And it probably technically should be in front of the size knob, because this happens before the actual reverb. What pre-delay does is it takes that reverb and shifts it in time before the reverb actually starts to play. So we can hear this here. Straight away, the snare and its reverb are really kind of happening all at once. Drag out the pre-delay. There is now this much space before the reverb happens. And you might think, why would I ever want to do that? Well, it can help define the size of your room. If you're looking to give the impression something's in a bigger room, then that will really help. So you can still use a short reverb, but create that sense of it takes a while for that sound to bounce back from particularly the back wall. Tight. You're getting that slapback in there, which in a mix, in a rock mix, that slapback point can be really arresting. It's great, but we're not going to get too much into mixing here because there's a whole other hole in which rabbits live. So that's what here is called delay. It's really a pre-delay which happens before this reverb that we've defined. And by having a little bit of pre-delay, we can have a wetter kind of a feel, and that can allow us to even pull back the reverb mix. Now, yes, here I'm tending to run the reverb mix a bit heavy, but that's because you want to be able to hear it fairly clearly. So pre-delay is a funny one, but where you're going, I just can't sort of get this to kind of feel like it's got that explosion, then pre-delay is part of what you're looking for. Modulation. Modulation is an inbuilt LFO, so it's essentially like a chorus, and it's chorusing the reverb. You'll not hear it as much on drums, but you'll hear it a lot on a melodic sound. If you're listening perceptively, you will be able to hear that, oh, that's moving around. The reason that you'll want to do that is particularly with short reverbs, they can start to whine. Hear how that starts to get this kind of echoey, ringy sort of thing to it. And the modulation removes that. So it allows us to have a short reverb that is going to feel like it's smooth and not ringing. Ringing does happen in a room. If you go into any room in your house, preferably like a bedroom or maybe slightly smaller, and one that doesn't have a lot of furnishings in it, clap your hands real loud, and then you should be able to hear, particularly if it feels like it's coming from the cornices or the corner between the wall and the ceiling, you'll hear this kind of that rings. That's really normal. So saying it should never be there in a reverb is kind of silly because it is there in a room. It's just not always the most pleasing. When we're making music, we're about making something that's pleasing. So your modulation is adding a kind of a chorus into the actual reverb. So again, if you're looking to reduce the feeling of thickness that this reverb is prone to having, you might want to reduce the modulation. That's all to taste. There is no right or wrong there. Just try to watch being too high, because then you start to get a flutter in there, which is like bad cassette. And there's no such thing as good bad cassette. We've then got an EQ. Now it's a high cut and a low cut. We can change the color of our reverb. So that's the color of our room. So you see how before this reverb, when we first started, the reverb itself was prone to being overpowering, but now that we've actually created a shape and a feel that matches what we're doing, then the reverb sits in there very, very nicely. So the negative can be too dominant, is just because it's not set up for this particular situation, which is again coming back to, while there are presets, best you don't use them. Take your time, learn how reverb works, and then you're going to get good results from it. And honestly, for a free reverb, this is about as good as any other, and it is versatile. For a beginner, it's a good device because it's free and it's surprisingly capable. However, as I keep saying, just watch out on using presets and going, I'll apply this preset and it must be good because it says that's what I'm trying to do. Because chances are it's not actually delivering what you're really trying to do, and therefore it'll be a mismatch, and then your mixes will feel like they don't gel, like they don't come together. That's going to bring us to part 2. Part 2 is going to be a much bigger thing. It's about what is reverb, how does it work? I will show that using a different device a lot of the time, simply because this has a visual display that's going to help us to understand. Take everything that you understand here back to TAL's reverb, and then you'll go, ooh, now I can be in control of this wee beastie. So the very first question is, what is reverb? Reverb is reflections in a space. The simple way to start to think of that is to be like, okay, I've got myself in a room, we'll call myself input with my great big bright red head. I make a sound, I go clap. Now we follow the red line, bounces off the wall, bounces off the wall, bounces off the wall, ends up coming back. I hear that as echo or reverb in the room. At the same time, the sound is bouncing in the blue line, off the wall, off the wall, off the wall, back to my head. And they will be doing that at slightly different times. If we were to take the red line and the blue line and straighten them out over time, we would find they were not the same lengths as each other. So we would hear maybe the red one first and the blue one second, in which case one clap becomes in return. As you could hear as I pulled down the diffusion in Tal's reverb, we could hear that the reverb went from being a to a and they are your reflections. So a reverb is made up of lots of reflections. The more reflections there are, the smoother the reverb will feel. And again, as I said before, don't go assuming that the smoother the reverb, the better the reverb. Why would we use a reverb or a space? Everything has to happen within what's called a scene. If we went to a play and there was no scenery at all, then we might find it a lot harder to get into that play. If we're to watch Romeo and Juliet, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou? Down here. That's generally put into a scene, a balcony, somewhere below the balcony, some bushes for him to skulk around in. That matches. If you watch the recent-ish Leonardo DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet, he's waving a pistol round in his hand and talking about his sword. You can pretend it's poetic, but it was just stupid because it didn't match. So in terms of reverb, that's helping to define the scene in which your piece of music is happening. And that wants to, in some way, seem realistic or, more to the point, organic for the track that you're doing. If you are making a track that's about being on a pirate ship and you use a very small room reverb, chances are it's not going to feel right. Because if you were standing on deck of a ship, reverb would actually be quite open and very diffuse because there's not a lot to bounce back from. So you could have some difficulties selling the idea of your song to somebody if the reverb space doesn't feel right. It doesn't mean about being literal, because art's always best come out sideways. You're there to tell people how to feel and lead them in that. But the reverb space that you use will help people to go, this is how I feel. Like if you put a jazz singer into a rock and roll space, then suddenly people won't be feeling like, oh, this is a jazz singer. You're going to want to tell people this is a jazz singer by putting them into a jazz singer space. And your reverb is a big part of that. So we want to use a reverb to locate a person in space. Super important. You can use, and you should use, a reverb to make something seem thicker, richer. People want to feel richness. If they don't feel rich or comforted in whatever way is appropriate for your song, why would they want to be in it? Again, smoothness. The reverb will add smoothness. If your singer is not the most even, then a good application of reverb will help them to seem more beautiful. And if you just go, oh look, I'll whack on auto-tune and I'll pull off reverb because it's just too cheesy, man, then it's just going to sound creepy. So thickness, smoothness, and that overall sense of shininess and beauty. They're why you want to use reverb. Reverb styles, or space types, the types of spaces. So when you turn on your a reverb unit, and TAL doesn't show any of this, you can work out sort of roughly what sort of type of reverb you're using just by learning what they sound like. But a lot of digital reverb units, they will have presets filed under terms that are similar to what you see here. Room is emulating literally a room, like I'm in here in a room. It will assume a reasonably square room and generally a sound happening in the middle of the room. The reflections, as we see, travel outwards, hit the walls, come back in. So that will give us the feeling of being in a smallish club, like a jazz band in a club or a rock band in a smallish club. Very useful for intimacy, really useful for drum kits, because a drum kit is normally recorded in a room, and applying some room sound to our kit can really help us give a sense of liveliness and togetherness for that sound. The next thing that you will see, and often Reverb's default to this, is a hall. So a hall is anything from an extremely large room, often a bit longer, and often the sense is that the sound source is on one end, projecting, and sound's coming back. So you'll get that long slapback, which is the hit, space, bang, whoosh. So that's a hall space will tend to have those kinds of things, and then stuff coming in from the sides as well. Halls are great. They're a nice, simple way of having a sound, and probably the easiest, most common thing to use. In the older days, chamber reverbs were very highly regarded. Waves recently released Abbey Road chambers. Chambers are like a room, only you get to define how everything works. So quite literally what would happen is, say like in Abbey Road, they would set aside a room. Sometimes that was already predefined, but other times it would be impromptu. It would be like, oh, let's run a speaker out into the stairwell and then run a mic down the stairwell, and then we'll call that our reverb. It's a kind of creativity that could happen in the physical world and still can happen in the digital world. You just got to understand how reverb works. So a chamber quite literally was a room that you would run a speaker into it, you'd rearrange the furniture or the objects in the room that were designed to create diffusion or what have you, then you'd put a microphone somewhere else in that room. So you would get as unique a sound as you could make within that room. Some chambers had shiny walls, some didn't, all depending upon what they wanted to achieve when they built that chamber. But you won't see them as often in digital reverbs, but understanding what a chamber is pretty useful in understanding reverb. Now, one of the first reverbs that we controlled in a purely mechanical way was, of course, the spring. Occasionally you might still find a spring in an old-fashioned type of guitar cabinet. You know, a Fender Tweed type thing may have a spring reverb. So you'll have a knob, and as you turn it up, you get this funny, echoey, wobbly sort of a thing coming back. A spring can sound atrocious, or it can sound wonderful. It's hard to emulate them in the digital domain, but knowing about them is useful, because a spring actually is a lot of LFO type stuff happening. You fed the sound into literally a spring, kind of like a car spring, and then you tapped it on the other end and you've got a spring reverb. They can sound great. You know, 50s, 60s guitar will commonly have spring reverb on it. And then plate. Plates have become very fashionable again, as everybody's obsessed with this. We've got to have emulations of analog gear. But plates can be pretty special. A plate quite literally was a slab of metal, sometimes brass or something like that, but the metals could be anything that you wanted. Technically, you could make a plate reverb out of a piece of wood or a piece of glass or a rock. Technically, you can make it out of anything. You may not get great results, but you could. You feed the sound into one end, which is a top in this case. That propagates through your slab of metal, and then you tap the sound at the other end, put it back into the mixing console, and you would get a very thick, very dense reverb, generally quite short. And they were often used on vocals because you could get that real thick, smooth, shiny, very fast, very easily from a plate reverb. Understanding those shapes is kind of important. This will take some time and going over and over and over again. Reverb is one of those subjects that seems simple on the surface, but the further you get into it, the more complex it gets, and then it's better that you keep going and understand it by going it round and round and round than it is to just go, oh, it's too hard, and give up on it. As I was just talking about, shape. A reverb has a shape. It's very easy when you're starting out to think, oh, well, the shape of reverb is just like that. The top one, it's linear, as in sound happens, that's our input, and then it just instantly we've got reverb and it decays. as we saw with the pre-delay, the delay knob in TAL's Reverb-4, then we can actually create a gap between the input and the output of the reverb. So that would be like the top image, the linear image, only there's a gap between the input and the beginning of that ramp. So that's a very simple linear kind of a room. Easy to do in digital, but one of the problems is because it's so easy to do and it's easy to default to that, you end up making a space that feels, well, inelegant. It lacks shape. Just as you want a synth sound or any other sound to have shape and movement, you want your reverb to have shape or movement. And the lower of these two images is what's called a bloom reverb. And that's a very easy way to hear a wonderful reverb shape. So what we see there with our dots is we've got our input just like normal, but the first bit of the reverb is actually on the silent side. It's like the last dot here is actually at the beginning of here, and then our reverb ramps up. So there you've got boom as your sound. So boom, and that sounds gorgeous. It gives you a really nice kind of feel, and you get this explosive feel. And a bloom is a thing that's commonly used on snares in rock to get that sense that that snare is exploding. So the shape, kind of like the ADSR, the shape of your reverb over time has a huge impact on how it feels and how people will process the sound that you're giving them. Reverb in a DAW environment is invariably going to be called digital reverb because it's made electronically. Basically, there are two ways of getting reverb, and one is algorithmic, which is we put it through a process. Sound comes in at the beginning, it goes through a process and gets spat out the other end as what we perceive as reverb. That is one method. That is very much my preferred method because this matches how things work in the real world. Ultimately, your sound's going to come out and it's got to have people feel like it's real. Even if it's synthesizer sound doing synthesizer music, people have got to accept it as being real within itself, organic. And if your process is lacking in the basic rules of how physics work, it's either going to stand out as being striking, but odd, or weird. And too many times people set things up and they just sound weird, and then they wonder why it kind of fails. They may like it because it sounds striking and odd, but it's weird and it fails. So understanding how your reverb algorithm works will really give you a lot of ability to finesse that to achieve the shapes and style of what you want. We'll go through those in a moment. The other type of reverb that you will encounter these days is a convolution or impulse response. Now, as you see, I don't hold a lot with them. My opinion on impulse responses and convolution reverbs is a lot like the image that I show you here. Yep, that's me in Montana 5 minutes ago. Trust me. It's the equivalent, as far as I'm concerned, and I know not everyone's going to agree with me, but this is why I'm not touching this. It's the equivalent, in my opinion, of those Facebook cameras, which is what this is, where you stick bunny ears on yourself. You have not become a rabbit, just as I'm not in Montana or wherever that's supposed to be. I have merely tried to give an illusion, but at the moment you look at that and try to accept it as like, oh, there's Benedict in Montana, you always know that is wrong. There's always a sense of it being broken. The bunny ears. When I move around, the bunny ears will have to keep trying to track my head and they will be wrong. It's not the equivalent of me putting bunny ears on my head. So not a fan of impulse responses or convolutions. Get into them if you want, but while they sound amazing on the first instance, I think they do more damage than good. Go back to algorithms, because algorithms behave, as I was saying, exactly the way things do in the real world. So you've got an analog of the real world. Let's take a bit of a look at two possible algorithms. The first one is a simple parallel algorithm. So we've got our input sound. It's fed off to 4 delay units. And we'll show you how this works a little bit more later when we come back into a practical side. Delays 1 through 4. Each one has 4 echoes. First one, second one, third one, fourth one. You can see that they all start at slightly different times. And once we glob them together at the end, we get something quite complex sounding. So that would be the equivalent of plugging our sound into one thing that feeds 4 different delay units. So we feed 4 different delay units with slightly different timings on them, and then summing them all at once. That's going to give us quite a workable reverb sound. With only 4, it may be a little on the rough side, but it will give us a nice reverb sound, especially for rooms. The second one I show here, the complex or serial, is that we input our sound. In this case, it's going into a master delay. It then goes out to delay tap 1. Delay tap 1 is fed through delay tap 2, which is fed through delay tap 3 and delay tap 4. Now there is going to be a mix there. Let's say for simplicity's sake, we're 100% wet on delay tap 1. Then we've got 50% of delay tap 1 and 50% of delay tap 2. And then we keep that 50-50 on each one of those. That may not work out in reality, but it's easy to get your head around. So by the time the signal's coming out of delay tap 4, it's really complex because it's picking up all of those extra taps, kind of like if we put 4 marbles in a can and rattle it, we can kind of almost hear each one of those individual marbles. But if we multiply those marbles, so 4 times 4 times 4 times 4, 4/4, then we have got a lot. And I can't do the math quickly enough in my head, but we have got a lot. 64 or 128 or whatever it is, maybe more. We've got a lot of taps. So that gives us that far more complex thing on the other end. But in this case, we're also tapping off the sound that's coming out of delay 4, sending it back to our master as feedback, which means that it runs through again. So even straight away, if we were at 128 taps audible in our reverb, like 128 marbles in our can, just one going back once now means we've got 256 taps, 256 marbles in our can. That's getting very, it's almost going to start to sound like water as we shake our marbles because it's that thick with marble. We can also introduce an LFO, which is that modulation, chorusing into our feedback. And we're probably going to need to minimize its tendency to want to howl, to scream like Jimi Hendrix. That's a more complex kind of algorithm. Now, when you buy a reverb, whether that's downloading TAL's free Reverb-4 or going off and buying, so-and-so's Pro Reverb, chances are you've got an algorithm that's somehow related to one or both of these images that I show. That's algorithmic reverb, and they match kind of what happens in the real world. If you think back to that image of a room with sound bouncing around, this is doing that. In terms of if they're stereo, if we took taps 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and split them sideways, left and right, we would end up with a nice sense of movement left and right, which gives us the illusion of sound bouncing off walls. We do not need a lot to start to create reverb. So algorithmic reverbs are beautiful, and they're beautiful because They adapt based upon what they're doing inside themselves and, of course, to the instrument or the sound that they are being fed. Now let's look at this in practical terms. So we will listen to our drum thing again. This is just a delay, and you can hear here it's not doing a great job of making a reverb, but we can see quite clearly our delay taps. At the moment we've got one delay with echoes. That's a horrible reverb. However, we've got a couple of ways of approaching changing that. The first one would be to reduce our time. Now, yes, that's not what we're going to call a nice reverb, but with small amounts of it, it's actually very effective. And it was quite common in the early 80s to hear particularly drum machines, you know, CR78s, TR808s, what have you, with reverbs that were similar to this. So it shows us that with a high feedback, we can actually get a kind of reverb starting to happen. If we were to put even 4 reverbs with different timings all ganged together, we would start to have a fairly nice reverb. I know because I've got quite a few devices out in the market that I use myself, which are built under this very model. However, if we go back out to our long timing and start to add in diffusion, what we can do is we can see that these lines that were loud and proud now start to become kind of messed up. This shows us how diffusion works, and you can see it in the RV7000 as we're looking at it. Where we've got our taps set up, if we had a 20 millisecond delay time, every tap, every echo happens every 20 milliseconds. If, however, we start to add diffusion, it makes our timing loose, meaning that this one's come in early, this one's come in late, this one's come in early, this one's come in late. It randomizes them. So that means that we end up with a looser sense of, and a less mechanical sense of, the space that we've got coming back. If we also add in extra taps, if we magic extra taps out of that and say, okay, I'll give you your one right on 20, but I'll also add one in a little early. And in this case, I'll add a second one a little late. And in this case, I'll add one a little early and one a little late. Then suddenly your echo is becoming a lot richer. And this is super important because this is how we actually get the results that we're looking for. Back here. Hear how it's starting to sound like reverb. Now we can increase our spread. So by spread, we're saying how far those taps can slop outside of where they're literally supposed to be. Listen to that. It's a very simple way of making reverb. Now, in this case, RV7000 is being kind and giving us all those bonus taps. If we were to make it ourselves with delay units, then we would have to add an increasing number of delay units to do it, which gets complex because you've got to physically create them. But nonetheless, 5, 6, 7 echoes all at once will give you some of this, but once you get up to here, I don't know how many taps there are in there, but there are quite a lot. There could well be 128 easily. If we reduce our time, here we've got a reverb. It's too long for here, and we might want to roll off some of that high frequency. In other words, we're damping it like it was in a room that had some furniture or heads to absorb some of the sound. And that's still a 215 millisecond delay time. If we tighten this up, and we can control how we're damping our low frequencies. And it's easy to think you want all that low end in your reverb, but chances are you don't. There are times you do, but for now, simplistically, you don't. So we've created our own reverb sound really quite simply. And the downside in this instance is that we can't control the shape of it, which is why you can either get into having controls, which gets really, really complex, or going back into algorithms like this. You can see this is the algorithm that they have made, and they've given us different room shapes. Hear the difference there with room 3. You can hear that bloom, as in whoo, it comes up after. And then 4, even more so. So that's getting us right into the territory that we had when we started with our TAL Reverb. Long, diffuse, with lots of bottom end in it. So one reverb to another, ultimately they will all sound like each other once you understand how they work. So going back to TAL's Reverb, with what we now know about creating reverbs, we can set the size of our room, how diffuse we want our room to be, how smooth we want it to be. I tend not to love super smooth rooms because they just don't feel right. You rarely get them. But at the same time, super smooth is great for vocals where you're really wanting that smooth, sexy, shiny thing. Then a lot of diffusion is good. They'll never be exactly the same because we've got more controls in here, and this is set to be a real bloomy sound. If we increase the diffusion, this will probably bloom a bit better. RV7000 is known for being an incredibly clear and bright reverb, The TAL Reverb is known for being very thick, so trying to turn them into the same is probably a waste of time. We could spend a lot of time turning them into the same, but nonetheless, your TAL Reverb will give you a very nice result once you understand how it works. So we set up our size, we set up how diffuse we want our room to be, like this is how smooth. So if we're chasing a plate, we want full diffusion. If we're chasing a room or a hall in particular, we want to pull that diffusion right back so that we can hear the individual bounces off, particularly the long walls. Delay, the more we want a hall, then the more delay we want at the beginning. Modulation is just as to how thick we want that sound to be. This probably isn't the most powerful sounding, simply because they've controlled those parameters to try to stop it from becoming too wobbly. Fair enough, otherwise people would end up with some horrible results. And then your tone, super important. Simple as that. Now, again, as I've said, take your time with reverb. It's like compression. It's one of those things, you think it's going to be easy, and then you get into it and you find that it's a can of worms. And then you sort of think, oh, well, I'll just use presets. That'll solve it because somebody else has told me that this is the proper thing. But it's not proper for your sound. They built it based on their sound. So if I saved off the sound that I've got here, and you opened it up, chances are it wouldn't fit your kit, especially if your kit and your drumming was very different from what I have here. You would go, this doesn't really glue together right, but then you try and pretend it does, and your mix would fail. So this is one of the advantages of going with a mix engineer who's skilled, and that's taken time to understand these things, because they can build your reverb space, the space, the scene in which your piece is happening, right from the beginning for you, and it will sound classy and well glued together. You can do an awful lot worse than starting yourself out with TAL-Reverb-4. Just understand that when you first turn it on, it's going to be too dominant. So you need to look at controlling the parameters and controlling the mix so that you get something that gives you the results that you want. If you have any questions, down below. Benedict again for higherhertz.com. If you want to stay up to date, please make sure that you subscribe, and you can pop over to higherhertz.com and subscribe there as well. You have a great day now.